So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for our international webinar, Rethinking Language Learning with AI. My name is Dr. Sophie Osman. I'm an associate professor at the Center of Applied Linguistics in the University of Marie and Louis Pasteur in France, and chair of the Educational Technology and AI SIG, Special Interest Group of the National Association for Bilingual Education. It's my great pleasure to moderate today's event together with my friend and colleague, Dr. Miriam Eisenstein-Ebsworth from New York University. Miriam, thank you for being with us today, and thank you everyone for being with us.
It's a great pleasure, Sophie. Thank you. Merci bien. So welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Miriam Eisenstein-Ebsworth, and I'm delighted to join Dr. Osman in moderating today's webinar. We are honored to welcome an outstanding panel of internationally recognized scholars. We have Professor Christiane Lütge from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. We have Professor Hayo Reinders from Anaheim University in the USA, and also from the USA, Professor Mary Kalantzis and Dr. Olnancy Tzirides from the University of Illinois. And we're very grateful to all of our participants for joining us from around the world. So without further ado, let's begin. Go right ahead, Sophie.
Thank you, Miriam. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Christiane Lütge, Professor of English Language Teaching at the University of Munich, and one of Europe's leading scholars in AI, digital literacy, and language education. So before we begin, a quick reminder, please post your questions in the Zoom chat at the end of each presentation, because we will address as many as possible during the final discussion. Professor Lütge, the floor is yours.
So thanks again. And today I'm going to interrogate what I call the algorithmic gaze, or what a lot of people actually call the algorithmic gaze. I'm certainly not just the forefront here. So there are many other scholars whom I will mention later on who have worked a lot in this field. But I find it particularly interesting also for foreign language education and the impact that we all need to consider much more than we might do right now. And so one of the first beginnings for me actually was finding something out about Joy Buolamwini, some of whom you may already know. So this whole concept of what we call the coded gaze, the coded bias, or algorithmic bias very strongly builds on her idea of the coded gaze, where she shows how AI systems reflect the assumptions and blind spots of their creators. And so you may have heard about one of her TED Talks that she delivered some years ago, and where she spoke about one of the experiments that she did when she had this search for beautiful skin in the Google search bar. And those were the results that she got. So you can see that in the background. And this then slowly led her to working on the very question, what's actually happening when we search for something? What are the results? And what do we see? What can't we see? And what does that all have to do with generative AI and the way that algorithms work? So, of course, this raises urgent questions about digital diversity, also about cultural representation, and possibly about inequality and marginalization in AI-mediated education. So her thoughts on the coded gaze and algorithmic bias have sparked a debate on the issue of presentation and also self-representation, because obviously sometimes when we use avatars in games, and there's also this aspect of how do we self-identify and what are the avatars that we use or our learners use in cultural studies and education. And there is much more to come, because we will be working with algorithmic projections of exemplary identities much more in the future, and sometimes even already in the present. So computer-assisted language learning, obviously, as we all know, somehow tends to be portrayed as a value neutral field, but of course it is not value neutral. So of course a lot of practitioners are quite aware of that, and so we also need to make sure that we transport that into the classrooms and are not led back to some older notions or approaches of teaching about languages in a kind of behaviorist setting, or believing that this is now some real representation of the world, and therefore that is such an important thing. So while diversity management essentially addresses the harnessing of diversity in corporate and market logic, a power critical understanding is what is often missing. And therefore, the question of who is missing and who is excluded is such an important question. So what we did, or what we sometimes do in some of our seminars, this is actually a seminar from last summer. This was a culturally oriented classroom scenario where our students explore topics such as global education systems or cultural life across different regions. And then they use generative AI to generate images, to create short stories, videos, and access cultural explanations in multimodal form. And at first glance, this appears to support digital diversity in learning. However, we found out, and all those students, these actual students found out and were actually very angry about the recurring patterns, about stereotypical presentations of their cultures, of homogenized visual aesthetics, and also those dominant global norms in imagery. And they were really angry, and it was a very small group of pupils, and we had 8 different nations here. And then we started working out from this field, and also this connected very much to one of the articles that we started working with. One was by Ohashi and Hubbard, and I can see that Louise is also here, and another one which was by Antoni Alm and Louise Ohashi. And so we started out from this in order to find out what's actually happening. Is Gen AI really helpful? Or the other question that we posed in this seminar, does Gen AI expand cultural diversity, or does it algorithmically structure? Yes, certainly, but also simplify and therefore limit it. So both may be true actually, but in this course, this was one of the overarching questions. And since I mentioned some of the literature already, I would like to draw your attention to some of those publications that have also delved more deeply into that whole question. Literacies in the Age of AI by Zapata, Cope, and Kalantzis. So Mary is here today, of course. And then also by Kathy Mills and Amanda Gutierrez on the critical literacy in an AI world. And one of the most recent publications is on artificial intelligence in our language learning classrooms, edited by Louise Ohashi, Mary Hills, and Robert Dykes. And then also there was another one also recently, which was actually also by Antoni Alm, who was a guest in Munich yesterday. So there are a lot of scholars who are very much also into empirically investigating, which we did not do here at this stage, but I would really like to recommend you to just have a look at these different studies and findings, because they really give us a very good state of the art for all of these questions that have to do with digital and generative AI. So now the digital diversity is, of course, the big question. What is all that? So, of course, digital diversity is a key concept, meaning the visibility of different cultural identities in digital environments. However, AI-generated images and videos often undermine this by reproducing stereotypical cultural imagery, by flattening the differences into visual cliches, and thereby reinforcing dominant aesthetic regimes in a way. So as Niaba, for instance, et al. Argue, generative AI really risks reproducing digital, even neo-colonial patterns by embedding dominant epistemologies into visual culture. And thus diversity here becomes algorithmically filtered rather than genuinely represented. Now, whether this is always true or must be like that is another question that can be resolved maybe at some, well, I don't know, when or what, but this is one of those questions that we educators really need to ask ourselves. And this also connects, of course, to the broader debates on the digital divide and digital inequality. While earlier research focused very much on access, that is, the digital divide needs to be, you know, yeah, in a way, fought or needs to be overcome by rather looking at the questions of access. More recent critical perspectives, including, for instance, David Kergel's work, is much more on the question of inequality. And in digital context, it's more about participation, on meaning making, and on epistemic inclusion, and not so much on the question of access alone. So in a way, this kind of digital inequality today is very much about visibility and about representation. So digital diversity is, of course, a pedagogical and an ethical issue. And this is also something that the UN Roundtable on Digital Inclusion took up some years ago, and they were really very strong on suggesting the digital inclusion, again, should not be limited to simply using existing digital devices and services, or just be about, as I said, about access, but it's very much about creating and influencing content, and also about the question of being involved in the design, in the development, the testing and assessment of digital devices. And especially, of course, involving people in marginalized positions or in situations of vulnerability. And that is a very, very strong point. I'm not sure how much the UN Roundtable has actually been, listened to, but there's always a chance that we can, put a bit more emphasis on these very important questions. So this algorithmic gaze, that is the term that's been used somehow as a synonym for algorithmic bias or the coded gaze. So here we often refer to the algorithmic gaze as something that sees how generative AI systems structure cultural meaning through probabilistic modeling and training data. So, of course, in Gen AI systems, some cultural representations are amplified, others are marginalized, and neutrality reflects the dominant patterns in data. And visibility, therefore, is never neutral. It is just computationally produced. And this is something that we have to keep in mind. Very briefly, these three kind of drops, it's very much about the question of algorithmic bias. Of course, corporate algorithms frequently train on data sets that reflect historical prejudices, baking those biases maybe even directly or indirectly into software. And therefore, this is something that has to do with what we also sometimes call the black box phenomenon or problem, because proprietary systems obscure very much how the decisions are made, making it difficult to audit them for fairness and discrimination afterwards. So it's already in this process of coding. And this is very difficult for educators, and especially if you're not an IT specialist, and I'm certainly not. And therefore to already see how the process itself is very much dependent on those biases that pre-exist. And then, of course, invisible shaping happens because digital environments quietly direct everyday actions and prioritizing possibly corporate or majority culture behaviors while marginalizing minority needs. So this is again what, of course, Joy Buolamwini was talking about when she was very much, not just in her TED Talks, but also her publications, turning her eye to the algorithmic gaze, to cultural representation and misrepresentation. And she's very keen on the question of how does facial recognition also come to play here, because actually certain bodies are misrecognized, revealing structural bias in computational vision. You may also be aware of some of these systems that are AI digital human brand ambassadors, like Sophie. She's actually like 5 or 6 years old already, and she can speak English, French, and I think also Japanese. But there are more modern systems even now. This was one of the first digital humans that were, of course, developed by a corporate, corporate or designed as corporate brand. And obviously, as we can see, this kind of Instagrammable person, very often we have Siri-like or Alexa-like young women. And therefore, again, this is also a question of who programs these people, these digital humans. Who decides about appearances? Is there even an option then maybe for users to claim what kind of person they want to talk to? Of course, this is all in the making. This was just one of the very first prototypes. So there will be options or sometimes even exist. But as you can see, the question of who programs all of these human or anthropomorphic beings that we meet, who does that? Who are those people? And that's something to keep at the back of our minds. And this was also something that very early on, like 2017 or 2018, Safiya Omoya Noble already pointed out when she spoke about algorithms of oppression and how search engines reinforce racism. So whether or not you agree with her rather strong take on the question of what algorithms do, it is, of course, important to also know this part of the discourse. So that means that in generative AI, very often dominant groups are just overrepresented and marginalized identities underrepresented or stereotyped, and cultural complexity is reduced into simplified categories. So obviously, this is important for all kinds of cultural learning, and not just in contexts of politics or for democratic societies, but we also use all of these pictures in our classrooms. So some years later now, Liu and Zhu, now very recently in 2026, argue that generative systems tend toward flattening and reducing variation into statistically stable patterns. So their study, in a way, this time empirically solidified a bit what, some years before was just some assumption. So they actually found something out in their study on digital diversity that is not expanded, and it's algorithmically reorganized. And they also criticize this kind of cultural homogenization. Okay, so let's just learn a bit about this to be still on time. So invisibility, as I mentioned before, is of course a central issue. So it's not always necessarily the misrepresentation or the cliche itself, but invisibility. So students often encounter AI-generated cultural content without this awareness of training data, or with not with the understanding of those bias mechanisms or the tools for critical interpretation. And I don't think we already have the right recipe here for doing something against it. But the awareness raising bit, that is still very much on the way, I feel. So invisibility is never neutral already. It reflects structured inequality. And the epistemic risk, of course, is the algorithmically produced representation may be mistaken for cultural reality. Now, with some scholars, we even find, and I've put a question mark here, even the differentiation between AI literacy versus algorithmic literacy. Others feel AI literacy is more the overarching term, and then algorithmic literacy is part of AI literacy. So, in fact, this terminology is rather broad here and could be actually different definitions. This is why I put up the question mark, but very roughly in many of those frameworks that refer to AI literacy, like the UNESCO and the EU frameworks, it's very much about using AI tools, interacting, and evaluating, whereas the algorithmic literacy, a bit more recent, of course, this term. For instance, Archambault, when she talks about recognizing representational bias, obviously that is more difficult, right? It's just more differentiated, or even identifying stereotyping in multimodal outputs, or understanding how probability structures visibility. I think this is really challenging, and also to teach about this, and I'm not sure I would be able to do that myself, but it's one way of tackling the problem of really suggesting that AI literacy enables participation, which is good, and algorithmic literacy enables critique. I wouldn't say that AI literacy would not also enable critique. So again, with the terminology, we could have quite different approaches here. But just so that you know, these two terms are sometimes used synonymously, and sometimes one is the kind of overarching term. So, of course, literacy in the age of AI, there is this one sentence I really liked very much when Zapata, Cope, and Kalantzis referred to some of the ethical and pedagogical dilemmas. They ask how to offer students equal learning opportunities and encourage their authentic voices if the system's default orientation risks othering their social acts or lived experiences. So in a way, this is something, yeah, as you can see, is the dilemma. So how can we even do that? Because the system itself is automatically doing something which is not in line with what we are looking for. So the flattening, the default option is not what we are looking out in terms of diversity. So this dilemma, in a way, should at least be the starting point for considering how to go about it. So some of those suggestions for critical engagement with Gen AI or some of those implications, this is actually also one of our classrooms when we produced some videos for, in this case, we used a video created by Delhi, and that was on the issue of homelessness. And we had a classroom setting and produced some videos here. And this was a situation where there was a homeless person and another person who took care of this homeless person. And the homeless person is that yes, can you see? Well, there's someone helping with sort of Asian looking background, and the homeless person is supposed to be a Black person. And then the students were very angry about the way of why this is the kind of how this is being done by Delhi, and they were going on into questioning why this is the assumption underlying. And there was an interesting classroom discussion that followed suit. And of course, then they were going on criticizing about some of the biases that maybe just underlying some of the Delhi algorithms. Some of the policy frameworks already refer to some of those problems, of course. So the policy framework, the EU decomp edu. Some of you may know that from the European perspective. There's a lot on this question of critical digital engagement and awareness of algorithmic bias, and also evaluation of digital content. And there's also the UNESCO AI competency framework, where there are some good chapters on the ethical AI understanding, on fairness and inclusion, and also respect for cultural diversity. So what we then tried also in the seminar, that is something we should not be reading all this a lot of text here. This is just part from the task in that seminar from the students that you saw at the beginning. And their task was not only to use AI or Gen AI in for their classroom task, but also for their seminar paper. They had to do it, and they had to at least re-prompt 3 times. And then also in all of these cases, they were asked to use visual materials, and it had to be a transcultural or intercultural topic from a background they were familiar with, not necessarily their own. Of course, most of them actually then referred to what they perceived was their background or backgrounds. Several of them were actually also had very interesting several backgrounds, but they were totally free to choose that background. And then they had to incorporate different either video and or some kind of visual input. And then every time, exactly after the first prompt, they were completely angry with the system, didn't want to go on. So they had to at least 3 times or more times go on and reprompt and reprompt and reprompt. And then the prompts got longer. And they were also then asked to document every detail in between. So the answer they got, they had to include that all into their seminar paper. So the whole thing was rather a portfolio than a kind of classic seminar paper. And then at least there were also some reflection phases and things they did. So one of them started off with a German family, and well, this is what they got, which also makes me rather angry as someone who's not originally from Bavaria, but from the north of Germany, where we also would rather not be happy with this presentation. And then they added some, like, could you have some diversity in there? And then they thought, well, maybe you could even go on. So there were different perspectives and still more questions that came up in the course of this coursework. Some of those prompts, for instance, they had this kind of happy family on the beach, and this was the first thing that came up. And then they tried to put in some cultural diversity. Then something like this is not very much more diverse. It's, well, actually changing some of the color tones. And then there were even more modified prompts. And then they were like, not exactly falling to this loophole of going into the depths of everything, because where do you stop? Where would you say now it's good now? But they had this feeling of, okay, I can go on and on and on and really work on my prompts. And then they were sharing from their own perspective and their own cultural perspective and also expertise, how they thought, I am happy now, and I feel this is something I can show to you. So that was, for instance, about the topic of marriage, and then we had the Somali woman, and then this a guy from Cyprus, and of course their backgrounds were very different, and they went on and on and on criticizing the system until then they had something which they felt somehow familiar with, or that they could still criticize, but they could then criticize it in front of the classroom and show everyone why this is still not something that could even be true, because the colors would not be used in their background, in their cultural context, or this would never be something you would find on the table, because they would never put a kind of salt on the table on the right side. Or that was really interesting for everyone to learn. And then we also had some very nice material that was used also for classroom preparations on questions of quite different distortions and also stereotypical representations that are used by AI image generators on nurses. So distortion of Halloween costumes and cliches. And also this other case about homelessness and who are the homeless persons, who are the doctors, who are the engineers, and so on. We also used some of the material that we thought was also creating what we felt was like backlashes when interrogating the algorithmic gaze. Some of you may have heard of this case because last year Google was actually forced to pump the brakes on its AI image generator called Gemini after critics complained that it was pushing bias against white people. So the controversy started, you guessed it, with a viral post on X here, and you could see that account is actually also called itself End Wokeness. So according to that post from that user, when asked for an image of a founding father of America, Gemini showed a Black man, a Native American man, an Asian man, and a relatively dark-skinned man. And asked for a portrait of the Pope, it showed a Black man and a woman of color. And this might sound like a technical explanation for why the tool overcompensates. Google had taught Gemini to avoid falling into some of AI's classic traps, like stereotypically portraying all lawyers as men. But yeah, so our tuning to ensure that Gemini showed a range of people failed to account for cases that should clearly not show a range. So embedded within any algorithm, of course, is a value judgment. And then, of course, as you can imagine, this caused a row on X because some people just felt this is why they could actually now really fight against each other about why should we use more diversity in digital education? This is what happens then. So this was also some brilliant material for just, for a counterintuitive case and for still pointing to the fact that it is still important. And then also, of course, some of you may be aware of Joy Bolangwini's very interesting text version of AI Ain't I a Woman on the blindness and limitations of artificial intelligence, which is again turned speech, and it's a reference to a very old traditional speech poem, which is also rooted in the history of the African American history, and that is a very interesting case that can be used in a classroom, especially with language learners and English language education. So leaning in and beyond digital spaces, this is really the question that in a way has been such an important part of our journey up to here. And I think we have not really mastered, or we haven't even started finding out about all the problems, because we are always looking for the recipe and which one is the best device now, which one would we use, and what would you recommend? And so I feel that we should really very much go back to some of the questions that are more about raising awareness. So it's more about learning beyond the classroom, learning in and beyond digital spaces, developing autonomy, agency, openness, and then, of course, exploring and embracing digital and global identities a bit more. And then also be open, of course, for all of these algorithmic new phenomena that we meet. But at the same time, and this is something we also spoke about 2 weeks ago in Paris, and my colleagues are not here, we did just a larger symposium together. And we somehow stopped, not in a skeptic mood, but in a kind of, we were like, but there is this overwhelm, this kind of digital overwhelm anyway. And now on top of this, we also add all the challenges that we see surrounding the question of algorithmic bias. And so, like, ending on a positive note, I think we have excellent material, so some of which I just showed very, very briefly, but that we have been using in our seminars, and that are the starting points for discussions, the starting points for discourses with our students, maybe also opening up some different perspectives. For instance, on that X, this message on X that you just saw 2 or 3 slides ago, because they could be starting points and they could help raise awareness, but they are certainly not the recipes into understanding all the intricacies of the algorithmic gaze. And as I mentioned before, for every one of us who is not really coding themselves, might just not be fully aware of all the dangers also lying underneath. But I think we should not be too afraid either. So this may not come as a total surprise, because a lot of people who know me also know that I'm very much into Gen AI, but this context of what we do in terms of teaching about cultures and learning about cultures in a way makes us even more aware of the fact that we have very, very different perspectives. And that is something I would like to close with. And I'm very interested to see what your perspectives are. And now my temperature is actually up to 41 degrees. That is not my temperature, but in this room here.
In Paris.
Thank you for bearing with me. I hope you can't really see myself too clearly here. Thank you so very much. And I'm very interested to see how we're going to further develop algorithmic literacy together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
thank you, Professor. You go, Megan.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Professor Lütge, for this very inspiring and illuminating presentation on interrogating the algorithmic gaze on critical engagement with Gen AI-mediated interactions in language education, and clearly it goes way beyond that. You reminded us of the importance of engaging critically with AI while keeping educational values at the heart of our practices. So now we'll move on to a brief question, answer, and comments session from the audience. Before we introduce our next speaker, we have 5 or maybe a little more minutes for this, but we'll try to be efficient. So I will go to the chat.
Yeah, but you have to send it to everyone, not to panelists and for like Joel. Joel said thank you, but it's not for everyone. Stella too.
All right, so we have a lot of expressions of appreciation, and wow, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you for the translation, Kimberly MacArthur. It's hot.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's because it's really like yeah, it's rather late in the day, and then with the heat, I hope I was not too, or did not feel too completely yeah, unconcentrated, or but just excuse my situation. So I'm usually a bit fresher.
Yeah, thank you, Christiane.
So what I'm going to do is read a few of the comments, and then I'll ask Dr. Lütge to respond. And then if we have time, we'll look at some more. So Gabriella says, I want to do something similar, but with translated texts, to see what might be accidentally introduced when making software translations for multilingual learners in the US. And Amélie Sellier says, I don't think it's even possible to represent diversity. And then we have Louise Ohashi saying, in response to the pictures of the nurses, looked like a comic book to me. I understand that feeling of anger you mentioned after seeing the nurses. So could you comment on a few of these responses?
Yeah, so in a way, what I feel reminded of when we talk about all of these presentations and representations of Gen AI. Basically, this is not a new question, right? So with every schoolbook publisher in the past had to make a decision. And then there was always the decision, what is family? How do I represent family, right? And then for decades on, we were just used to, well, this is the textbook. This is what the textbook looks like. Sometimes we were making fun of it. So when I started learning English, that was family, a very, very stereotypical English family from Epping, Betty and Peter Clark, and they were 11 and 12, and the boy was older. Then there was a daughter, and it is a very, very kind of, yeah, family kind of picture with a dog and a cat. And it took a long time, really decades, for the first single parent to appear, or divorced person, or of course, is now we have all kinds of constellations. So tomorrow in Munich, there will be the big Christopher Street parade going on. So until anything like that was textbooks, it took a long time. And so in a way, the question of representation is always a problem, right? You have to pick a picture, you bring it along, you make a choice, you make a decision. And the other phenomenon that we are faced with is decision fatigue. And I sometimes feel myself being in some kind of decision fatigue because I have to pick a picture. Do I bring this one or that one? Well, could there be a problem with this picture, or is there anything wrong about this one? Do we have enough women? Do we have enough whatever? Have I excluded anyone? And sometimes this leads to some kind of overthinking. And I understand when teachers sometimes feel stressed out because they feel there is the burden of so many decisions they have to make, and also never to exclude anyone. It is just not possible in a way. So whatever we can just try to do is improve, be aware of the choices we make, sometimes maybe criticize ourselves, or maybe also have some very good peers as colleagues who have a critical eye and maybe suggest that there's always someone or something left out, and that we do not fall back into essentialist ways of looking at certain cultural contexts. But that has always been true in a way. So I feel that with Gen AI, and especially those options of course, of picture creation and video creation, this is just stronger than ever. But the real question is the same question. You have to pick some material in order to take it to the classroom.
Thank you. We have a recommendation from Donna Albrecht in terms of translation. She feels that Claude is stronger for translation with cultural relevance, but doesn't have as many languages as ChatGPT, for example. And I wonder if you would comment, thinking about languages, on the issue of language varieties and how AI could be used both positively and negatively in terms of alternative varieties of both big and small languages.
That's very interesting. I'm not sure I'm an expert here because there may be others, especially knowing also non-European languages and those questions that may be in connection with that. So I think in the long run, this might be overcome. Is my rather naive assumption, but that may not be true, because in a way it should be possible to train actually for every language. But then, of course, the data sets are maybe, well, more financially interesting for some countries than for others, or for some linguistic backgrounds. So if you ask me which one is best for the biggest variety, I wouldn't be so sure about that. I think there are different ones that are maybe more used in Asian countries or European countries, or even African countries. I'm not sure when there is this one that is actually the best.
Okay.
And maybe it's even also not helpful because we've always been doing that in all kinds of applied linguistics contexts, always looking for the perfect app, the perfect book that we use or the kind of material, and the kind of perfect material that we now use. And I fear that we might be always constantly like searching for something that we may just want to integrate into what we do anyway, and in order to improve, constantly improve, and not like now I've finally found the holy grail. I
Right.
don't believe it exists, but I'm not an expert in suggesting, well, this is the
Okay.
tool. Maybe it's here somewhere.
Thank you. And I think one last question. Well, Mark Cotham says, I'm curious, what are some situations in which classroom language teachers are planning to use AI, where critical awareness is important? And they'd like to hear from more teachers. That there is a Facebook group called AI for educators, where you get a very big range of people from all over with questions and comments. But I wonder what you, if you, having shown us a couple of examples, actually could just maybe make an additional suggestion about classroom language lessons where critical awareness is really important, and what the affordances of AI could contribute to that.
You mean some certain? I didn't quite get that. There was something
Well, I mean,
my system. I
yeah,
couldn't quite.
I think it's a practical question. Can you,
Yeah.
is there, can you, in addition to the one you gave about the picture of the beach and how the prompt changed everything, I thought that was excellent. Can you think of an additional kind of language lesson where critical awareness is really important in using AI to support the lesson?
Yeah, well, of course, when you, rather than like suggesting that yourself, like starting from the other side, for instance, so every pupil can put something into the classroom, whether you have some different cultural or language backgrounds or not, there will always be a lot of different pupils, right? So there are different identities, and so even when you feel this is a very homogeneous classroom, it's never completely homogeneous. So maybe looking for the heterogeneity in your what you perceive as very homogeneous can also be very interesting, and therefore even just looking for something, even if you ask them like, have your the stereotypical bird, if you start with young learners, and even if you go for not exactly contested ground that really causes some friction, but you go for something that is what does a family look like, what does a happy place look like, what is home look like. There can be so many different pictures. So rather than starting out from what we feel are the problems, the differences, the challenges. This is very often the starting point for a lot of language teaching, learning, also intercultural encounters and intercultural problems sometimes. So starting out from yeah, the imagination of your learners and how they envisage their dream home, their dream future, their dream garden, their dream animal, or whatever kind of. And then you will have a lot of very, very different images, and comparing how these different perspectives can be so different. And then obviously also what we should always consider is you do different things with the young ones than of course in older pupils, or if you have some kind of intermediate levels, you would apply different kinds or sets of prompts, or even sets of goals that you are looking for. So I find it very interesting to start with rather young children, well, young learners, but in this positive sense of use it in order to create something positive, right? This is a positive thought, and you create something. What do you like about it, and how would you then speak about it? And then you already have so many different versions. And you already get aware that the same system can produce many different versions of happiness when different people ask for those prompts and then refine their prompts and so on. So maybe that's one point really. I do not really like the idea that teaching about cultures is always very much centered on what is the problem, what is the intercultural clash. Well, they do exist, of course, and there are stereotypes and all that, but sometimes we can really go for more commonalities or individual experiences that show us that perspectivity is something which is of value, and that we can incorporate that a bit more. Sorry if I just
No, thank you so very, very much. I'll turn it over to Sophie, who may have an additional comment and introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Christiane. It was really interesting. Thank you for everything. Thank you for being here. And now we have our next speaker, Professor Hayo Reinders, internationally recognized for his work on learner autonomy, teacher education, and AI-supported language learning. He's a superstar, and we are so proud that he's joining us. So, Professor Reinders, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have not yet been called a superstar before today, so I'm very, very happy. Thank you. Merci bien, Sophie, Myriam, pour votre invitation, and welcome everybody so much for. Thank you for joining another day, another talk on AI. Can you believe it? But here we are. There's a lot to talk about. Sophie, can I just check with you? You're able to see my screen, right? The PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's good.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I'm in Scotland at the moment, where it is 30 degrees. So the Scottish people are completely flabbergasted at what's happening to them here. Anyway, so let me just switch to gallery view so I can see you beautiful people, and then find my PowerPoint. Where are you? Here we go. There we go. Yeah. So the student will see you now. Wouldn't that be something? That would be quite the transformation, where the students will not only decide what they want to learn, but when they need support and when they want to meet with you and so on. We're not quite there yet, for better and for worse, but we do have some very interesting things to discuss and some interesting challenges to ponder. So I'm going to try and do something that I shouldn't, which is too much, but I think the only way to kind of make sense of what's happening is to try and sort of cover all aspects of what's happening around us. And I'll hope to be able to convince you that that was the right choice. So I'll be talking about hybridity. I'll be talking about heutagogy and humanization in language education in a time of AI and other transformative technologies. And all of that in the name of Kurt Lewin's mantra, there's nothing as practical like a good theory. So let's dive into just that. So yeah, let's go all the way back to basics, people, because we are being challenged to reconsider, what we mean by just about anything and everything, including something as seemingly straightforward as, what is knowledge? What do we mean when we use that word? Not actually that straightforward to decide what does and doesn't count as knowledge. We've known for a long time, and especially as a result of technological developments, that knowledge can be and is highly distributed, from the arrival of the internet and, of course, smartphones and so on. I don't know what you know, but together we do know that we are part of a community. We have, maybe if we're part of the same culture or country, we have historical knowledge, we have intergenerational knowledge, we have social knowledge. We distribute that knowledge among, communities and people in ways that, as I said, I don't have access to on my own, but collectively we do. And I think that's a very important point to remember. Now, please bear with me. I'm just going off on a hobby horse of mine, which is trees. I love trees. I collect rare fruit trees in my farm in New Zealand, And this book actually just really calls into question what we mean by knowledge and communication, all these things that we think are, human specific. They're unique to humans, or at least to animals. But Peter Wohlleben, who's a biologist, in this fascinating book, shows how trees, especially trees in forests, actually communicate with each other. They know through their underground root systems. They know when one of the trees, hundreds of meters away, might be in distress, and they send, extra nutrition to that other tree. Even if it's obviously completely, a selfless act, it doesn't help them directly. And here's another fantastic example. If you're a tree and a giraffe comes and starts nibbling on your leaves, you might just quickly send out some chemical signals through your underground roots to nearby trees to warn them, and that will allow the other trees to, and this happens within minutes, to send bittering agents into the leaves of their canopies, so that by the time the giraffe gets to that tree and it starts munching on those leaves, it won't taste as good anymore. So it'll probably leave the tree alone. So there's this sort of communication, there's this sort of shared knowledge, even beyond what we think of as human, or at least animal kingdom related knowledge. And that, I like that idea very much, because it's it sort of allows us or encourages us to reconsider what we mean by some of the things that we say are specific or are unique to being human. By the way, Peter Wohlleben calls this the wood wide web, which I think is just such a delightful little term. But right now we are no longer just talking about knowledge being distributed. We're now actually increasingly seeing knowledge being outsourced. And an example of that is the various devices that are on the market that allow you to remember and record all the things that happen around you. I wear, not right now, but I wear something called a limitless AI device. It records 24 hours a day. Of course, I can turn it off whenever I want to. And it allows me to do things like say to it, hey, last year, October, I had a great conversation with someone. Can you remind me what we talked about and the name of that person? And it will do that for me. And that's a way of, as I said, outsourcing our, in this case, our memory, for better or for worse. But it's certainly increasingly able to be done. And that's only the tip of the iceberg, because increasingly we're seeing that this type of knowledge generation and memory formation is becoming part of literally our environment. And terms like ambient computing, which relate to something that you might be more familiar with, the Internet of Things, make this really practical, because ambient computing, or the Internet of Things, allows devices to have sensors embedded in them, and then send the data that they collect through some sort of network to whoever benefits from that. So, for example, in our library at our university, we have sensors in our seats which allow us to monitor occupancy, and also allow us to, for example, track who's there and who isn't there. And that's an interesting proposition, isn't it? Again, a lot of challenges around that, a lot of privacy and ethics concerns, which I'll come back to a little bit later, but certainly a lot of interesting developments there. Taking that one step further, we now have an increasing number of companies and research departments that are developing various forms of augmentation, including brain augmentation. The Neuralink is one that's sort of been promised for a while, but we're getting close to implementation. That initially, at least, out of very noble intentions, aim to help people with, for example, degenerative cognitive diseases to regain various abilities, including the ability even just to communicate with the people around them. So very noble sort of aspirations, but you can see that this immediately calls into question, like where does the human ability and knowledge end, and where does the technology sort of take over? And these are not straightforward questions. Taking it even one step further, we have a lot of companies now that are developing various types of devices that are able to collect and send out signals, including what I've referred to sometimes as neurograins, which are tiny, tiny little devices. You can see the image here. That's actually somebody's finger. So these are really, really small. They're so small, in fact, that they can be put into basically anything. They can be put into a pill that you take in the morning, and it will go through your bloodstream, and it will record your glucose levels or whatever, your heart rate, and it will send that information to you and maybe to your GP or whoever you assign. And the interesting impact of that is that it allows, for example, a GP or another health professional to be forewarned when you are developing something that might become a problem. So in the not too distant future, you might be contacted by your GP, and she might say, hey, look, you have a stomach inflammation, and you may not have any symptoms whatsoever, right? But it's building, it's developing. So you go in and you fix it before it even becomes a true medical issue. So what we refer this as is a form of proactive healthcare, proactive medicine. It's not about remediating. It's not about fixing you when you are sick. It's about preventing you from becoming sick in the first place. So yeah, you can see there's it raises a lot of questions, not just about kind of knowledge, but also, of course, what we're interested in as teachers. It raises questions about learning. And that's what I want to focus on in the rest of the talk, is like, who is doing the learning, and who is responsible for the learning that takes place in a context like the one that I've just laid out for you. We've known, of course, for some time now, at least a couple of years, that people, not just students, but also teachers, tend to appreciate the speed and the ease of, for example, AI or other generative technologies. I can just get whatever I need. I can get the product, and I can have it now, and it will be, generally speaking, it will be quite good. But that, of course, is an emphasis on efficiency. And learning, of course, is about effectiveness in the long run. You do want some efficiency, but really it's about effectiveness. You want your learners and yourself to be process-oriented, and you want to, you want some sort of struggle in the learning process. Without struggle, there's no real development, as I'll come back to later. So yeah, that raises a lot of very interesting questions. Where do we bring in the technology, again, whether AI or AR or wearable glasses or whatever it may be, and where do we sort of pull up the drawbridge, so to speak? Gillian Code, who I believe is in Canada, sort of puts it in a very nice visual way. She says, look, on the x-axis, we have the level of automation that AI allows. And on the y-axis, we have the level of control. And at the moment, we sort of tend to be mostly at the bottom right of this matrix. We tend to allow human tasks to be replaced by AI. And the question, the challenge that she poses to us is, how can we find ways to move more towards the top right? We want the benefits of the automation, of course, but we also want to maintain various levels of control. Now, the good thing is that despite some of the fairly transformative and really, in some ways, the word is overblown, but still quite radical, or at least potentially radical implications that technologies like AI have. We're not entirely flying blind when it comes to responding to them and developing meaningful pedagogical answers. We have a range of sort of scientific and theoretical disciplines and canons that we can draw on. One obvious one is the theory of distributed cognition, which over the last 40, 50 years has taught us a lot about how thinking is not limited to, of course, the individual, but how it permeates different types of ecologies, how it interrelates between individuals, between groups, between things, between artifacts, between environments, etc. There's a lot that we can actually learn from that to better understand what is happening at the moment. Another one is extended mind theory, which helps us to understand, both from a philosophical as well as a practical point of view, how tools sort of shape our cognitive architecture, if you will. But the one that I want to focus on here, because I think it has really important practical implications, is the notion of hybrid intelligence. Because one thing is clear, it is that our future, whether we like it or not, is going to be some form of hybrid collaboration. Even if you are the kind of teacher who hates technology, doesn't allow any AI in the classroom, your learners, of course, the parents of your learners, the community that you're in, of course, are affected by it. So you are, by definition, as well. So there is a level of hybridity in every environment. Now, let's make this a little bit more practical. What does this mean for me on Monday morning when I'm designing my course or designing, an assignment, for example? So let's imagine that we are teaching, a particular class which involves helping young 18 to 19-year-old, 17, 18, 19-year-old learners to prepare for university study. So it's an EAP type program. Our learners are reasonably proficient, they're B1, B2, and let's also assume, for the purposes of this scenario, that they have access to Wi-Fi and AI tools, which of course is not always the case, but let's assume that for the purposes of this example. Now, like many thousands of learners around the world, I'm going to ask them to prepare and then deliver in class a persuasive presentation on a contemporary social issue, right? Pretty common, sort of standard EAP type assignment. Now, often what you see is that not just individual teachers, but schools and policies either allow or don't allow the use of AI, or they might say you're only allowed to use it maybe in a limited way, but it's often a very sort of generalized decision. It's either good or it's evil. A more practical approach is to think of it in a more pedagogical way. You don't need to read everything that's on the screen here, but when I teach this type of class, usually I kind of break down the course into a number of different stages, a number of different skills that I want my learners to develop and that I want them to get feedback on, all the way from kind of choosing an initial topic to finally reflecting on the product that they come up with and thinking about the strengths and weaknesses. Now, interestingly, if I sort of think this through from my personal point of view, and I am someone who generally likes at least experimenting with technology, when it comes to the first sort of micro task or sub-objective, choosing a topic, I would never want my learners to engage in using AI at that stage. To me, the ideation stage is about exploring what's in your brain, your memory, your personality. It's about communicating and collaborating with others. It's about being challenged by people in your classroom who might have different cultures or different opinions or whatever. It's a process of exploration. It's a process of, frankly, it's a process of struggle and creativity. And creativity and struggle sort of are in some ways synonymous. So I wouldn't want to outsource that in any possible way. However, there are other stages of this process, like, for example, for me at least, number 7, drafting the notes that learners will use in class when they're giving their presentations, where I might say, well, actually, if we don't really have time to do that collaboratively, maybe that's something that I could see my students using AI for, right? Now, your choices might be very different from mine. That's not the point. The point is that we need to be a lot more nuanced in terms of our decision making. We need to think about it at from a pedagogical point of view. Like, where should, as it says at the title here, where should the work happen, and who should do that work, and what support might be acceptable or beneficial at this particular moment in time. And that leads me on to the next sort of core component that I want to discuss. So the first one is hybridity, the ability for both learners and teachers to collaborate, to negotiate, to interact, to work together with AI. Now, that requires a number of quite advanced skills on the part of everyone involved. And the reason why I choose the word heutagogy, I think, will become apparent as we go along. But for the moment, you can broadly think about it as a synonym for learner autonomy. So we want our learners to have the ability and the willingness to make decisions for themselves about their own learning. And what we'll see, hopefully, in the next few slides is that this notion of taking control and making decisions, although valuable, is increasingly being questioned. And that's why I will, as I will explain, use the term heutagogy instead of autonomy. So what am I talking about? Well, firstly, we are still, I believe, in language teaching, in most contexts that I'm familiar with, not making enough reference to and drawing enough on, and we're not being enough aware of the very, very wide range of different spaces, not physical places, but spaces that learners occupy, and the different forms of learning that those spaces afford. There's a lot of work, going back at least, well, actually 100 years, but certainly, since the late 1980s, that has explored these different forms of learning and how they can be supported. Things like the ability to learn by yourself, self-learning, the ability to learn with your peers, the ability to learn within a community, mentor-based learning. Also things like, which I'm very interested in myself, digital game-based learning, the spaces that games and online communities create that we can draw on. That's still not part and parcel enough of most language education around the world. And of course, it's vital because these are the environments that our learners are going to be operating within in the future. And so, yeah, especially when we consider adult learning, the numbers are difficult to obtain, as you can imagine, but the majority of it takes place outside of formal education, outside of formal learning. So we really need to think about how we are going to prepare our learners for, their future abilities, so that they can manage their own learning by themselves without our help. And so this chronicity aspect, the time aspect, the lifelong learning aspect, has been recognized since the early 1980s with Henri Olek's work on learner autonomy. But At the very least, it needs to be expanded to include what I like to think of as life-wide learning. So learners at any moment in time, even if they are taking your course, are of course also operating in all these different spaces, and they have their communities, their religious, their social, their personal environments from which they also benefit potentially. And so we as teachers have the duty to not only obviously pass on the language, but also to prepare our learners for the ability to navigate these different spaces. Now, at a practical level, at least traditionally, we thankfully have these days pretty good insight into what the skills are that learners need to be able to engage in this process of navigating. And we also have a pretty good insight into how, as educators, we can develop in students the willingness and the skills to do that. I'm not going to talk into too much detail about those practicalities because they're all laid out nicely in the position paper that you see on your screen, which I wrote for Oxford University Press, which is downloadable for free using the QR code there if you're interested. So I'll just very briefly touch on a couple of examples so that we're all on the same page before I move on and explore how this has changed and how it continues to change. So when we consider, the ability to regulate our own learning, we're thinking of skills like knowing how to motivate yourself as a language learner, right? Language learning, of course, is a multi-year process. It's a lifelong process. It's always going to involve tremendous struggle and disappointments and so on. And well, if you have a great teacher, they may be able to help you, overcome those temporary challenges. But of course, at some point in the future, you're not going to have that teacher anymore. So you need to develop the ability to recognize your own emotional responses, to regulate them, and to help yourself to continue to proceed. You also need to develop skills like knowing how to identify your own needs, your own language learning needs, your own study skills, your own affective needs, and so on. So again, just to summarize, these are examples of the kinds of skills that traditionally we have been attempting to nurture in our learners. And as I said, we have actually really quite good insight into what those skills are and how they can be developed in a practical sense. But now something fundamental is shifting. The landscape is actually changing quite radically. Whereas in traditional sort of self-regulated learning, we think of the learner as being sort of at the center of the learning process and as someone who ideally at least is autonomous in their ability to plan and monitor and evaluate their own learning. So the locus of control, if you will, is with them, is internal. And if there's any technology, it's usually as a sort of a passive aid. You might use technology to help you draw up a plan, and maybe use it to remind you of when your plan is due, but that's about as far as it goes. However, that no longer holds because now we have AI systems that talk back, and not just talk back. They generate feedback, not just on your linguistic performance, but also on what you are doing, your learning plans, the resources that you choose. Taking it one step further, they predict based on analytics your future performance. They will use whatever data they have access to build a model of who you are and what you will be, and as a result, they will present you with whatever it thinks is right for you, which means that your attention patterns are being dramatically controlled by the AI. So clearly, when we talk about self-regulated learning, well, there is no self-regulated learning, or at least not in a pure sense. There is a hybrid regulated learning that is a combination of the human element and the technological element, ideally in some sort of partnership, ideally. And the role of technology now, of course, is active. It's literally generating the course of your learning journey. It's active, it's predictive, and proactive, like we talked about before. So what does that look like then? Because the old model doesn't quite fit anymore. Well, now we have 3 layers instead of 1. We have the top layer, which is where the learner, engages in a series of choices and skills similar to what we saw before, motivating themselves, setting goals, planning their learning, etc. But they're no longer doing that in isolation. They're no longer doing it alone. They now have active and often proactive support at each of these stages from AI or whatever other technology they have access to. So now suddenly the AI might, play the role of recommender. It might say, well, actually, AI, think that now you should learn this, or you should use those resources. The AI will come in and evaluate your progress. The AI will come in and be a simulator and maybe even tutor you directly. So clearly, I am not the only one doing the learning here anymore, insofar as we consider the self-regulation to be part of the language learning process. So what becomes incredibly important is the ability for learners to negotiate with whatever the AI is doing. For learners to become very clearly and very strongly aware of what is being presented to them. And so the middle layer is a number of literacies that collectively we could refer to as critical literacies or AI literacies or digital literacies, whatever you want. Now, many of these literacies exist, and they're all important. I mean, especially things like provenance literacy, knowing, or at least being willing to ask, where did this information come from, who created it, and so on. Bias literacy, ethical literacy, all of these are very important. But to me, the one that is the most important, and the one that I want to highlight here, which relates to the notion of heutagogy, is epistemic literacy. And this involves kind of being able to take a step back from the learning process, not just asking, like, what tasks should I engage in, or what resources should I use, or how, strategies, how should I, work with these resources. But it's actually learners' ability to look at the broader picture and question things like, why? Why am I doing this in the first place? Why does my learning and the teaching that I am experiencing, why does it look like this? Like where does this idea of learning come from? Is that my idea of learning? AI is continuously giving me whatever I want, whenever I want it. Okay, great, very efficient, but maybe not that effective. So it's the ability to not just look at the learning process, but look at the environment, the broader ecology, if you will, in which the language learning process takes place. So for me, going forward, the most important skill, at least for myself, that I see as a language educator, for me to develop in my learners is exactly this, epistemic literacy. So you might wonder, well, okay, that sounds nice, but it also sounds a little bit vague. How would I know if my learners are developing this epistemic literacy? And I think this is where we really need to rethink how we measure, observe, evaluate, etc., our learners. We need to find new ways to make hybrid learning, because that's what it is, visible in some way. Now, I've got a few examples on the board here. I'm not going to read out all 4 of them, You'll get the PowerPoint slides later, I'm sure. But an example of a way to gain insight into the learning and thinking process of my learners would be to ask them to not only submit, say, an essay or whatever I want them to produce, but also alongside a prompt log. So tell me what prompts you used. Tell me what changes you made to those prompts. Tell me what suggestions from the AI you accepted as is. Tell me what changes you made and why. Yeah. So now I can see, your ability or lack thereof to engage critically. Yeah. Another example is the one at the bottom right, reflection journal. Don't just hand in your product, don't just give me your presentation, but give me a reflection on how you worked with the AI. How did it make you feel? Did it make you reconsider how you like to learn? Did it make you question your previous learning practices? Did you gain any new ideas or insights about yourself, right? So these are all examples that, to me, represent learners' epistemic agency. And increasingly, to me, that is my job now. Yes, every student can produce a perfect essay and a very good presentation, but that's not really what I'm interested in. Are they developing the lifelong and life-wide skills that they need? Finally, we've talked about hybridity, we've talked about heutagogy. The final piece is humanization. We talk about this a lot, we hear this a lot, the human has to remain at the center, but we're not very good at sort of operationalizing what that means in practice. And I'm going to try and do this in a very short amount of time. But to me, the element of humanization is about putting friction, struggle, challenge back into the learning process. We are optimizing now for efficiency. We're optimizing for products. We're not optimizing for human development. So that includes things like asking yourself, what to me is the most important aspect of learning a language? Now, everybody will have a different response, okay? So I've put a couple on the screen that reflect my personal, views. One of them is identity. To me, language learning, and as a result, my teaching, is about helping my learners to become a new person, a different person, hopefully a better person, yeah? Having them question who they are, having them gain new ideas, new insights, new cultural viewpoints, new opinions from, a different way of thinking and being. And so to me, I want to bring this struggle of, figuring out who you are, who you want to be, who you could be, who you should be, back into the learning process. And that affects the choices of topics that I introduce. It affects the types of materials I bring into the classroom, etc. Another one that I want to highlight here is the notion of ambiguity. AI is so confident. It creates generally really quite good materials, really quite good feedback. It's really good at certain things, but it's never ambiguous, or it certainly wouldn't allow for that. And of course, again, this is personal, but to me, the whole journey, the whole beautiful lifelong journey of learning a language is experiencing ambiguity. What does this word mean? What does that accent, mean? Why does this person not understand me? And so on. It's not just dealing with ambiguity, it's reveling in it. It's being able to be confident in your uncertainty, right? That the ability to do that and the willingness to do that, to me, is at the heart of heutagogy, and it's a purely human aspect, and it needs to be, I think, part and parcel of the language learning and teaching process. Now, your list may be different here, okay? This is not a prescription, but it is an invitation for you to sit back and think, like, what are the things that I really don't want to lose, that I really don't want to be removed from the educational process? And so now we're no longer just saying yes AI or no AI. Now we're saying things like, well, let's have some really deep conversations and and some really, deep reflection on how we feel in different contexts about different aspects of the learning and teaching and supporting learners. So now we can think in terms of tensions, which are a lot more interesting, right? Now we can think in terms of finding balance between, for example, do we want optimization in this particular class at this particular moment in time? Do we want speed and efficiency? Or do we want to emphasize exploration? Do we want to emphasize instant clarification? Or are we happy to spend some time on productive ambiguity? And again, for you, for every one of you, the answers to these questions will not only be different, but they will be different probably for every class and for every group of learners. But the key point here is that we need to start asking these questions and be okay with engaging with these tensions. So that's my presentation. I asked AI to generate a beautiful final slide for you, and this is what it came up with. There's a link to my website. There's a bunch of tools and resources and articles that you can download there for free. So feel free to do that. Also, you can contact me through there if you have any follow-up questions, if we don't get to your question today and the rest of the presentation. So that's me, ready for your questions.
Thank you so much, Hayo.
Thank you so much, Professor Reinders. That was brilliant and fascinating, and I learned a few new words. Thank you. I learned about heutagogy. Thank you.
Yes, you got it. Well done. You must be a teacher.
So let's take a little time to look at the questions and comments from the chat. Let's see. Right, so Gabriella says, my concern with learning and AI is that it has the potential to become a rich get rich and poor get poor situation. Learners with self-regulation abilities and motivation to use these school tools responsibly will advance rapidly, while those without will use it as a shortcut and effectively bypass learning throughout their formal education, putting them behind in the long run. This effect might be particularly exacerbated in learners with disabilities, which can impact the ability to self-regulate. So does this perspective resonate with any of the research, and are there any ideas for what to do about these challenges? Excellent questions. What do you think?
Indeed. Really important question. It's interesting because the answer is not as straightforward as you might think. Some of us worried, rightfully, about, for example, the gap, in terms of access to technology, access to reliable Wi-Fi, being able to pay for, good models, LLMs, etc. Yes, that's very important. It's a problem that appears to be able to be, over time, I think, to be reduced and removed, simply because of the increasing access to things like smartphones and the ability to use smaller models and to use cheaper models, but still producing very good quality. So it's a big problem, it's a big challenge, but I see that there's a lot of developments happening in various places around the world that will hopefully help to resolve at least a lot of that. What I see as a much more insidious issue is the fact that, and there's recent research showing this quite clearly, large-scale research, that learners who already have the ability, the confidence, the willingness, the skills to engage with technology in a reasonably critical way, who have at least the makings of a heutagogical, knowledge base, shall we say, benefit from, especially AI, very, very quickly. So they really benefit, they really improve whatever skill you look at, whether it's language or math or whatever. Learners who don't have those mindsets, those predispositions, those skills, don't develop at all, right? So they not only not quite develop as fast, but they sort of stay flat. So what happens, of course, is that the difference between, in inverted commas, good students and struggling students gets bigger and bigger. And that, to me, is why, the notions like hybridity and teaching students about hybridity, the notions of heutagogy and teaching students how to become heutagogical critical learners are absolutely fundamental.
Okay, thank you. So the affordances of AI might help us with scaffolding, but on the other hand, we do have to contend with students who need support in developing thinking skills, critical awareness, and the ability to use AI creatively in a process sense, as you said.
Yeah, and just to add one thing to that, it's not just about the scaffolding, it's the ability to not only to build a good scaffold or to work with, or to, skillfully navigate the scaffolds that are available to you. More importantly, pedagogical skills involving asking, do we actually need to put a scaffold up on this particular building? Or do we actually need to build a new building? And that's the ability for a learner to be able to step back and say, hey, the learning that is being presented to me here, the resources that the AI gives to me, for example, they don't reflect how I want to learn. They don't reflect who I want to be. And of course, this is a really big issue because, AI always reverts to the mean, right? And if you ask AI, what is language learning? The answer that it will give you, to put it bluntly, is Duolingo. Yeah. Why? Because it's the largest company in the world, and learning vocabulary and getting scores and points and what have you is obviously what people do. So that must be what language learning is about. So that's eventually the lowest common denominator that the AI will revert to, and it will present you with, eventually it will present you with word lists and grammar checks and what have you. As a learner, and of course as a teacher, I have to be able to say, well, actually, there's more to it than that.
Okay, thank you. Two other comments I think we have time for. One is from Virginie Privat, who says, I love the idea of epistemic literacy being the most important competence to develop. But another concern from Nal Yu, who says, if we shift our assessment from product to process, will that create more work for teachers? And how can we keep that workload manageable and meaningful rather than reducing it to oversight?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Nalu. I'm going to share my slides again because there's something actually that I didn't get to talk about, but I'd love to. Can you make me oh, I still have access. Here we go. Share and then play from current slide. Yeah, here we go. So here's an interesting challenge to you. If we're talking about assessment in the broadest sense, evaluation to examination, etc., why do we still need that in a context which is not far off into the future, where we can know exactly what our learners are doing at any moment in time, right? So if you're able to monitor and observe, how often your learners engage with the learning materials you provide with them, how often they, practice their speaking skills with the AI chatbot, how they do on the various, quizzes and tools that you provide to them, etc. Why then do we still need assessment in the way that we used to think of it? If I want to know how you are doing, I will just, take my fishing rod and throw it into the river, and I'll just see what's floating past, and that's where you are. And I can address what you need, which may be linguistic, it may be cognitive, it may be affective, it may be social, whatever, at that moment in time. So I think that this is the biggest problem that I see, and this is a highly contentious opinion with AI, is that we're not allowing, because we are rightfully, very importantly, scared of it, and we should be. But we also, as a result of that, don't allow it to be as transformative as it could be in the right ways. And for me, if I could do away with language testing, at least 90% of it, and if I can use that time and energy on actually being able to observe how you're doing, how it's going, and maybe communicate with you and so on, well, that will be, to me, that will be, the Holy Grail.
Okay, beautifully said. Thank you. And thank you for a very inspirational talk on designing learning experiences. Sophie will now introduce our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Professor Reinders, for this inspiring presentation. So we respect our time. Mary's here, yeah. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Kalantzis and Dr. Olnancy Tzirides. I'm sorry for that. Yeah.
All good. Tzirides, no, all good. Thank you, Sophie.
From the University of Illinois. They are well known for their work in education and learning, helping teachers and students use new and effective ways to teach and learn. Their presentation is entitled Language Learning After Generative AI. Thank you both for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Put my microphone on. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers for holding this webinar and handling it the way they have, and importantly, to thank over 80 people who've attended. It shows how important the issue is for us, and how all of us need to get together and explore different ways of engaging with these issues. So it's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and it's wonderful that so many are still in the webinar. So what we are going to do, Olnancy is controlling the slides at her end, because we're in two different parts of America. I'm in Illinois and she's in California. But there's three parts to what we're going to say. And the first is what we understand by AI. So it's really important what we're talking about. Secondly, like the two speakers before, what are the challenges and for language learning and for educators in general? And thirdly, also like the previous speakers, we're going to give you a case study of what we've developed, a pedagogical platform that addresses some of the very difficult issues that have been raised already in this webinar, and also addresses how we maintain our values, our educational values. And I think that's what we all share today, and that's what brings us together. So, but first of all, there are 2 points I want to make. Which are extra points to what I'm going to say in terms of the topic. And the first one is, I want us to remember that for the whole of human history, mostly meaning making was made through oracy and multiplicity of meaning making with bodies and sounds and languages, etc. It wasn't until the invention of the printing press that we had closure as well as other openings. 800 years for higher education, only 150 years for education. And with that came a different set of norms and a different set of behaviors and a different set of closures. More recently, and not so long ago, we moved into what we call the digital age. But already, and we thought then multimodality was important, hybridity was important, ubiquitous learning was important, and there were ways in which we were going to integrate that into our teaching. But all of a sudden, AI has turned up, and it didn't come from us. It didn't come from the university. It didn't come from the academy. And it's exploded upon us. And we're all a bit like, kind of creatures with the lights in our eyes saying, what do we do? What do we do? So these meetings are important. The second point I want to make is who owns this stuff, right? Well, in France, there's one man with Mistral. In America, there's half a dozen of them, which I've listed there. And in China, there's a growing number of people who actually own the large learning models. They've scraped and stolen everything that humanity has produced to date and are continuing to do that. And now they're selling it back to us for $20 a month or maybe $200 a month, depending on what we get. Now, these people, particularly the ones in America, are very powerful and have control over government and a whole range of other aspects, and they are refusing regulations and refusing any guardrails. So I want to make this second point. All of us as educators are also citizens. We have to participate in this moment in designing, expecting, and demanding guardrails and demanding regulations for the way in which AI is developing and is taken up by our children and others. So that's just 2 points I want to make before I start. So The first point now after this introduction is to go back to this moment where we all hold precious, the printing press. It's so precious, literacy and language are able to be recorded and flourish. But it was a moment of the reproduction of texts. So texts were created by certain people. They contained particular knowledge. They were very controlled. Not everything was included. There were gatekeepers for what kind of knowledge mattered and what different mattered. So we have to be cognizant of that as well. But the most important thing, although it was a huge revolution for education and meaning making and the circulation of languages, it was reproduction, the reproduction of what some people were allowed to print and some texts that were allowed to circulate. However, the next point is that once that happened, once literacy became spread more widely, there was a kind of a movement towards a new way of organizing society that produced new inequalities. And this is an important thing to remember. It was the ideology of opportunity, but all of you will remember that what we dealt with was this idea that we put our learners on a normal distribution curve, and that we had assessment, and I agree with the former speaker that assessment is one of the most crucial things that we have to address, because we put people on this curve and said some were geniuses, some were gifted, and some were idiots or morons even. Now, we might not use those harsh languages, but we still have this idea that examination plots people in terms of their performance, which creates necessarily more harm to some people than it does good. So what do we have now? Oh, no, yes. With the introduction of the large language models, what we have now is not the reproduction of text. We actually have a machine for the first time in human history that produces text from all that's been stolen and all that is owned by the people who have the large language models and control it and fine-tune it and produce the algorithms. They have armies of people who are working to do that kind of work, and we have to kind of figure out how to be prompt engineers or how to work around it. But this technology now actually produces unique ways of making meaning as we prompt it. And it's impossible to say that there's plagiarism now, because every time you ask it to do something, it's different. The patterns that it produces is different. So we are in a radically different moment in terms of AI. I want to step back just a minute to say that actually the term artificial intelligence, which was coined by John McCarthy in 1955 with a group of others, they were after a research grant, and they thought that this word would be useful to look at the way in the way they can make machines to behave like humans. But there was another scholar at the time, Norbert Wiener, who talked about cybernetics. And that is the relationship between animals and machines, the communication. So we, in our work, in our research work that we do at Illinois, we prefer cyber to artificial, because what's in the large language models and what we get out of it is not artificial intelligence on its own. It really is a relationship between the social and the human. So our orientation, and I think the previous speakers said something similar, is that we're talking about cyber social learning. How do we design it? How do we create it so that our values are maintained and we use something that is not going to go away and for the moment is unregulated, and there are no guardrails until we insist that they're there. So there is, just to kind of generalize there, the difference between the knowledge, right, that is made by AI is very different by the way that we humans make knowledge. Generative AI its semantics is just latent. It's just about the word order. It's very, very flat relationship of tokens to tokens. And it is generated by brute statistical force, right, which is designed into the models. And its limits are the corpus, whatever's in the corpus. Whereas humans, they make meaning theoretically and grammatically through the functional classification of morphemes. We use semantic primitives, part of speech, and we learn how to do that in complex ways. But the most important point, and I think this was made earlier too, is meaning for humans is embodied in experience, right? It's made in the material world. And even the text that we produced or have produced to date is pragmatically dependent on embodied materiality. So those differences really matter. However, the point that was made earlier, and I'm going to make also, is that AI is everywhere now. It's on our bodies, it's in our pockets, it's whatever we do. We go to the doctor, we use a search engine, we go shopping online, we use an email, banking, you name it, health. And every time we enter in these spaces, it learns from us. The machine and the digital devices are gathering data from us all the time, even if we don't want to give them to them. We are the content producers that keep feeding the corpuses of the AI, and it's just become almost impossible for any of us to think that it's not part of our lives and we don't have to think about how to use it effectively. So, what are the problems for education? And I'm going to be very brief about this. If we could go to the next slide. I want to say, first of all, Lo, that there is a reaction all over by parents, by teachers, by educators, even by some of the tech bros themselves, who see that what is happening with the way AI is being introduced into countries, into people's lives, into children's lives, is uncontrollable at the moment. So we're seeing this enormous backlash. But right in the middle of this slide, I've put in one that a heading that says that the First Lady of the White House here has a competition. I think the competition is over now. She's encouraging all children to take up this AI challenge. Why would somebody like that do that if not in order to produce markets for those half a dozen people, right, who own the larger language models? So we're in this kind of very weird space at the moment in relation to the larger language models, how they produce, how they're developing, how they want to get access into our schools, want to get access to our students. And we have to be aware that we as educators are not just the creators of curriculum and pedagogy, but also need to be involved in this larger revolutionary movement around meaning making and the control and ownership of knowledge, and knowledge that we continuously contribute to. So educators in particular are worried about what they call cheating. This has become a big issue that students, they can't stop students from using it. And some smart fellas called it democratizing cheating. So we're in a moment now when educators don't know what's happening when they set a task and their learners return with particular ways of dealing with it. Actually, I was playing a game with my grandson where we had to answer. He's only 10, and we had to answer a question, and he would say, "Oh, wait, yeah, wait, yeah," and then he'd come back with an answer, and I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm asking Google to answer it for me." So, at 10, he's so used to being in this world and quickly engaging with it that cognitive offloading is happening, as we play a game. And this is a real issue for us. So is there a solution? And this is a solution, and Olnancy will draw it. This is a solution that many educators are deciding. Let's go back to closing the door. Pen and paper, right? What's in your memory? Can you write it down? Trying to avoid cheating and to figure out what people remember. But the pedagogy behind this type of assessment is short-term memory for the exam, right? And handwriting, right? You know, when you type now, you know, you have much more flexibility about what you do, and handwriting is much more limited in what it allows you to do, although we used to use whiteout and rubbers and stuff like that. So this is not an answer for us going into the future, but I can tell you in my own university, in the College of Business, which is one of the best in the world, it now has resorted to putting students in a room like this without devices and asking them to answer questions in the blue book, like in the old days. So I want to go to my next point. There are 5 calamities in AI at the moment, and one of them, of course, is cognitive offloading. We are worried that the machines will take thinking away from us, and that's a real problem in terms of the haphazard way in which this is happening. And of course, epistemic injustices, because the cost of those tokens, right, are increasing and increasing and increasing. And the cost of accessing the large language models are becoming more expensive. The Chinese ones are cheaper at the moment, but generally, given the next point here about the eco-apocalypse, you know, the environmental damage, the issue about water and electricity is becoming absolutely huge. And of course, the private ownership by the few of our knowledge, this is something we should be alarmed about. You know, all our knowledge as we live and breathe and as produced in the whole of, you know, human history that's produced text is owned by those men, and I put the pictures of them there. I wanted you to see them, the one Frenchman, the half a dozen Americans, and the Chinese. These are just a bunch of men, right, who are powerful and are controlling and owning the knowledge that we have all created. And we can't sit back and say that's okay. It isn't okay, and we need to be actively involved in that exercise. And of course, the implication for the massive job losses. I mean, educators even fear that they're going to lose their jobs. I don't think they will. I think the role of the educator is going to change dramatically, and we who train educators need to be aware of this and to start considering how we do that. But many jobs already, and particularly even in the tech industry, thousands of people have been laid off because of the way in which the large language models can address or respond to prompts in ways that are more powerful than an individual human can do within the span of that time. So these are genuinely calamities for us, and we have to be aware of them. However, as educators, we do value the traditional didactic pedagogy, you know, the one teacher, the 10 kids, 25 adults or whatever. But the affordances of the digital, even before we got to artificial intelligence or the large language models, can allow us now to do what we always dreamt of doing, collaborative learning, personalizing learning, having students relate to each other, the teacher being able to attend to the needs of every individual child. We call this now the possibilities of the cyber-social pedagogy, and how can we use the digital domain as well as the large language models in order to create opportunities, pedagogical opportunities that meet some of the things we couldn't do in the traditional classroom. So why is this possible? And again, very quickly, because of the time we have together, the digital and now artificial intelligence allowed for 7 affordances and these are important, ubiquitous learning, anywhere, anytime. Like you can learn now, you don't have to be in a classroom, you don't have to be present. Learning is empirically ubiquitous. Recursive feedback, you can get feedback in the moment. You don't have to wait till the end of the class or the end of the program where formative assessment is provided to you. Multimodal meaning makings. In the whole of human history in the past, multimodality really mattered. Multimodality matters again now, particularly, as we communicate with each other, whether we're using text messages or pictures or whatever. Multimodality around text and image and sound and data and much more is a critical way of making meaning and of communicating. And learner agency, it really matters. We always wanted that, but the traditional classroom limited the possibility. The teacher would ask a question, one person would put their hand up. But now we can involve every learner in those digital devices in active meaning making. And somebody asked a question earlier about who can participate and who can't participate. It is possible now for everybody to participate at the same time without being noisy within these spaces, the affordances of the digital and the cyber social learning environment. And collaborative intelligence. There's not a problem in the world now that doesn't need collaboration, where we have to work together to solve problems. Of course, we've kind of found ways to be divided, but nonetheless, we're divided in groups, not as individuals, but sometimes that too. But social knowledge is more important than ever. And the affordances of both what we call the cyber social and the digital domains make that possible. And thinking about thinking, metacognition, it is possible within these spaces to create those experiences where the learner, and I think we heard that earlier too in the previous speaker, can reflect upon what they're doing. Not only do the work, but reflect upon it and get feedback along the way. And my last point here is that we can move into what we call productive diversity, that every individual's voice, language, orientation, culture, whatever they bring to the learning environment can be honored, recognized, utilized in a natural way because of the affordances of the digital. Now, I ask all of you who are here on this particular webinar now, what tools are you using and which of these affordances are available to you and which of these affordances do you draw upon in designing the learning for your students? So if we go to the next point, we're going to look at this pedagogical platform, which we've called Cyber Scholar. Dr. Cope and I and many others in our team have been working for years on technology to see how we harness it in productive ways. And for language in particular, although there's anxiety about it, it is possible in this moment that it's not just the imperial languages that circulate. It is low resource languages of tribal people and other communities. It's a time for those to be can be integrated in this space. Though I think somebody said earlier, I know that I'm of a Greek background, and Greek hasn't, because it's a small community, it doesn't circulate on all those tools that are out there. But the possibility is there, the affordance is there. And in terms of the knowledge economy, and again, I think there was a question about this before, it is possible to think of equality now and not just that curve, right? How do we ensure that everybody meets their potential and not thinking that we have to distribute people in this kind of random way in order to kind of look like we're being thorough? But to do that, we need to create new learning ecologies and collaborate with each other. And having conversations like this is part of it. And we need to become designers of these tools, not just by the commercial tools. The commercial tools which are coming out now are really about behavior control. Do math nonstop, do literacy nonstop, do X on your own. We have to, as educators, become skilled at working with each other to expand our teaching repertoires with new tools. And that's what we've tried to do and what Olnancy will now show you. But first of all, I want to get back to the issue of assessment. Assessment is the tail that wags the dog. It's our biggest problem. It's hard to overcome and create new pedagogy and new tools when assessment is so rigid and is so impactful. What we've created as part of this pedagogical platform is an analytical tool that every student has. Every student can get whatever grade they want because they can watch the petals of their aster plot. That's what we've called it, grow. But we've divided it. You can divide this tool in any way. We've divided it in 4 parts. One part, of course, is about knowledge because you're trying to teach something in particular. Another part is about focus. If you're working in the digital space, you need to know the kind of involvement that the learner has. Thirdly, help. In this environment, peer feedback, helping each other is very, very critical. But if you think it's critical, important, you have to grade it. So we also grade it. And the 4th part is how we give them every language model within this platform that they can draw on. What do they draw on? How much do they use and what purpose? It is possible to track it. And we have done that in this particular program. And Olnancy will give you a brief overview of how this pedagogical platform operates. So I'll hand over to Olnancy now.
Great, thank you, Mary. And here, I hope you can see my browser now. I'll go and show you basically what Mary just talked about, how we implemented it in practice through Cyberscholar and how we're using AI here. And I'll go directly to an example that's, let's say, a sample work from a student that are working on the issues that we are talking about, Gen AI and language learning. And let's say they have created their draft here. They are in the process of writing. It can be a multimodal piece of work. But as they are writing, they want to take some help from the AI in the way that we have implemented it in the system. And the idea behind the platform is that we're not going to use the general purpose chatbot that we can find outside, but the AI system here has been configured by our team, which is a team of academics based on research and pedagogical theories to support learning, feedback, and assessment, and be specifically calibrated to the topics and the specific course and learning goals that the teacher has. So let's say that the student wants to get some more ideas about opportunities and challenges presented by AI in language learning. What we have here is a tool called Cyber Helper, which is basically the student's learning AI assistant. And here we have 10 different functions, as we call them, that you can see on the screen, that are basically pre-populated meta prompts that we have created based on pedagogical theories that can help students during their writing. And we have here brainstorm that can help them generate ideas, research to get information specific about their project, and specifically if it's a research project, to help them with their structure and everything. We have plan that can help with outlines, expand and summarize to make the text longer or shorter. Translation, of course, we can help with learners, with multilingual learners. Check flow, which can help to check the flow of their writing. Advice to get specific writing suggestions. Proofread for general proofreading. And ask, which is this is similar to the general chatbot, but not exactly the same. You can ask any question that you want through that, but it will go through the calibration that we have created and the teacher has created. And I will talk specifically about this now. So let's take the example, and let's say that we want to brainstorm some ideas based on the opportunities and challenges presented by AI for language learning that we have here. And what happens now in the system is that we have a specific configuration that will run when we will have this function. What does this mean? We have all the different LLMs here. As Mary said, we can have access to all the different LLMs. So this platform is LLM agnostic, as Bill usually says. We're not tethered to any company, any big company, so we can choose any LLM. And the other important thing here is what we have and we call knowledge base. Knowledge base is a set of sources that the teacher can create, and it can include any kind of material, readings, language resources, assignment instructions, examples, all the different course materials that they can put in, that this set of materials will be prioritized when the responses of the AI will be given back to students. And we can see here the example that we have put in all the works and all the research papers by Bill and Mary, by our whole team, all the students' works, and this is actually tailored to what we will be targeting in the course. And apart from the knowledge base, the extra layer of calibration that we have is what we call rubric agent. The rubric agent is a rubric that, again, the teacher can create, and it includes different criteria. And these criteria are actually the prompts that the large language model will use to provide feedback back to our students. So basically, think about learning goals and evaluation criteria that actually the LLM will have in its mind when producing the responses. And every teacher can create their own. Here we have one based on Bill and Mary's theory, and we will be using it in this example. So going back here, as we can see, this is the configuration that we have. And once I start and I press run, the system, what happens now in the system is that it goes back to the knowledge base that we have provided it. It goes back to the rubric in order to know how to provide back the responses. And it focuses on what I have selected here, the text on my work as a student, and it will give me back ideas about this specific topic that I talked about. And once this comes up, like, it will take some time because it goes back to all these sources that I've mentioned. Once it comes back, you will see that it is very specific and very targeted to the material that I have provided it. And because we have the knowledge base at the back, it also produces, as you can see here, it has very good references of what we have of papers and resources that are specifically supporting what we are talking about. So we are reducing the hallucinations aspect. And we can go and we can see here, it has all the different ideas. And if I want, I can come back here, and let's say I am a speaker of French, I can come back here and I can say to it, can you give it this to me in French, and maybe make it even more concise. And what happens here now, it's actually, it will reproduce a response based on these ideas. And again, going back to the knowledge base and the rubric, it will produce it in French, it will make it more concise, but it will be a new response. It's not going to be just a translation of what we see here. So we can use it with different languages as well. It will come up quite soon. But the other thing that we are, I'm going to show you in a second, is that, and okay, here is the response. You can see it's in French, and I can continue talking to it and trying to find what it will be more helpful for me and put it back to my work. Now, the other thing that we have in the system, apart from the help while writing, let's say that we have created our draft, it's ready, and I want to get some feedback as a student before submitting my work to the instructor. What I'm going to do is that we have this functionality that is called cyber review. And because of the time limitation that we have, I'm just going to pull it up and here. The cyber review process, it continues and follows the same calibration. We can choose any kind of LLM, we can choose our rubric, we can choose our knowledge base, and it evaluates the whole piece of the work that we have here based on the criteria that we have developed as teachers. And you can see it produces a summary with specific aspects of what can be improved, what are the strengths and the overall assessment. And that's the summary. And then I can go and look at specifically the different things that are important. So if I scroll down and go to the criterion of concept, you can see it is personalized. It takes information about my profile in the system. It talks to me and it knows what I know about this. And it focuses on specific things that I can improve, and I can still continue talking to it to request it to make it even more concise or provide something else that could help me improve my work. And similarly with the AI review that we have here in the system, we also have the ability to for other students to revise their peers' work. So we have AI reviews, peer reviews, instructor reviews, and self-reviews following similar criteria. And all these aspects, the different parts of the reviews that we have, enable us to understand how the AI is helping, what is the contribution of the human aspect, and how is everyone contributing to the knowledge production, the work that the student is creating, and how this is evolving. And briefly, I will bring up the analytics again to point out what Mary already said, that we are actually tracking whatever the student is doing in the system in terms of the AI. And the point that we are working now is to make sure that we are tracking also how the AI is contributing actually to the creation of the work, and how much of the contribution is the AI, how much is the human contribution, how is the student revising their work, what are their responses to the feedback that they are getting. And basically, this part is what we are developing now, is targeting not only to see what the student is producing, but also to understand how they are thinking, how they are revising, how they are engaging with the AI throughout the learning process. And I think with that, I try to make it very, very brief. I'll bring it back to Mary to wrap it up. And here we are.
Thank you, Olnancy. We're sharing a lot with you very quickly, but we're hopeful that some of it is meaningful. But what we have here is the elements of this pedagogical platform. The first part, and critical, and anyone can do this, is have a bounded corpus, not sending your learners into the wild of the large language model. And, it's called retrieval augmented generation. You can put in the bounded corpus what your syllabi is, what the readings are, what the activities are, what the purpose. We call it the knowledge base, and our learners go into that first when they access what's called the language models. It's really our bounded corpus. And secondly, and that's designed by the teacher, the educator is crucial in all of this. The rubric agents, the teacher scaffolds the prompts, the tasks, and the work that the student goes through different cycles, from drafting to revising to finished product and evaluation, based on the rubrics and the way in which the rubrics scaffold their work. And the analytics, ours is one example of what we call assess as you go. A result at the end of an experience doesn't tell you very much, really. Students need immediate feedback as they're progressing, and our analytical tool provides them with that. Every student, as we said, have their own copy of this, and they can see it progressing, and it's very motivating. They all want to get very high marks, so they keep going over their work until they improve it to the level that they're happy with. But also tracking creativity, and this is the trickiest part at the moment that everybody's worried about. But we found a way to do that. We provide formative and summative assessment, and we track the degree of AI human interaction. The previous speaker said you could go in and find out anything your students are doing. Well, indeed you can in this platform. If we go to the final slide, on our second slide, we look at keystrokes, timestamps, click-streak logs. We have a way of documenting exactly how much they use, and we want them to use the large language models because they're going to use them, but we want them to use them ethically and we want them to use in assisting them, not replacing them. And so we've structured the pedagogical platform in ways in which they can get assistance from the corpus, the bounded corpus, to certain tasks that they're doing, but not, offloading their cognition to some large language model, but they work hand in hand. So that's the cyber-social thing that we're talking about. The machine and the student work together in evolving and producing whatever task is required by the educator. I think we have a research group. We call it Human-Centered AI Transformations, and we're experimenting. What Olnancy just shared with you is really research. All our students who come into our program, they're doctoral and master's students, sign an IRB. They know they're part of research, and we get feedback from them. And we keep improving the platform based on that feedback. What is it that works for them? What doesn't work for them? Because we don't have any particular answers at the moment. We're all in an experimental phase, and it's very important that we test everything that we're doing as we're going. We have a new paper that's there listed, and we called it Losing Our Minds, because we feel like that sometimes, but we're moving towards a cyber-social solutions for the challenges of what's called artificial intelligence. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for both of you. Miriam, we can take 2 questions because we have just 7 minutes.
Okay, let's see what we've got in the chat. Would you please elaborate on how the AI feedback, peer feedback, and teacher feedback will work together? And would students receive these as orchestrated feedback, or would they be able to make choices?
They make choices, right? They're options. Olnancy, do you want to say anything more to that?
Yeah, the structure that we have in the system is basically we ask students initially to, while they are creating their first draft with using the AI as I've showed you, and then once they feel ready, that their draft is ready, they get the AI review, and that's the first type of feedback that they get back. Once this is done and they have revised their work, they move and they submit their work for peer review. And then, and they are doing peer reviews to other students as well. And through this process, they are getting also the human aspect back. So they have a time period in order to revise their work based on the peer feedback. And after that, after the second revision, they are submitting their work for instructor review. And that's when the instructor comes in and evaluates the whole thing and provides also feedback. And at the end of it, we also have the self-review, apart from all the other 3 types of reviews, which the self-review brings everything together as a self-reflection for the student to tackle that metacognition aspect and understand how these different feedback aspects help me to evolve my thinking, how they improved my work, what I have learned so far. So that's how it works in the system. And definitely they choose what to implement and what to revise in their work based on the different types of feedback that they are getting. But that's the process that we use in the platform. And it can be it can be flexible. Sometimes some teachers that we have used the system with, they use only the AI reviews. Some people use AI in peer reviews. Some other people use AI in teacher reviews. So this can be depending on how you want to do it as a teacher.
Thank you. Another question. It's very clear that regulation is inconsistent and yet very needed. What can we all do to demand greater AI regulation?
Yeah, right. Well, in America, it's non-existent, although there is some pressure now from parents and organizations, and not so much from educators, because we're still struggling about what to do with it. I mean, it's odd because it didn't come from us and we don't think it's ours and it's out there. It's really a strange moment for educators. Really, because it really requires rethinking everything we do. But it comes from citizens, who think that their children and their schools are voting citizens, that we need guardrails to protect our children in particular. And some governments have banned social media, at least, for certain ages, both in Europe and Australia for certain grades. But we as citizens have a right to a voice and to organise and to say, this is our knowledge, this is our content. It can't be owned by these handful of men who are up there controlling it and becoming trillionaires and not giving anything back. Nothing comes back, right? They just use it to become richer and richer. So we as citizens need to say, okay, we see this, we can't stop it because, you need formal ways in which to stop it, and you need governments to act. So voting citizens need to have a voice and need to organise. And we educators need to have much more complex conversations like we're having with this webinar. You bringing us together makes us think of different things and ways we have to address it. The education system is very slow because the business model relies on presence. Right? You have to be there because you've got to have the rooms, the electricity, the gardens, the whatever. And anything that says you don't have to have that anymore threatens the business model of the education system that we know. But that is what we're facing. And we do have to use space, the spaces we have differently. And I think the previous speaker said something like that. We'll be having arguments in the gardens or meeting for a debate, or, we have to not think about classrooms, one teacher, the textbook, turn the page, the exam. We're trying to hang on to that as the golden standard from the printing revolution. But this moment means we have to open up to different ecologies, right? But we can't do it on our own. Before we could change things on our own in a classroom, change the textbook, change the test. Now we have to work collaboratively to invent tools and learning experiences that enable us to prepare children for a future that is different from the one that I grew up in anyway. It's very, very challenging for them now in meaning making, and particularly in the learning of languages. Learning of languages is like learning math. It's a cognitive advantage. We have to argue for it. It's not just about using the machines to kind of talk to each other in different moments. It's about culture and society. It has much more involved in it than what the devices can do, and we have to keep arguing for that and to keep creating new ways of engaging with the affordances of the digital. Harness them for our values, not just for the money some people make with the apps they produce. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. I wish we had more time to discuss these very, very important issues. But this has been very worthwhile. We want to thank NABE for its support of this very important conversation, and the many voices that we've heard from the US, Germany, New Zealand, France, Singapore, Cyprus, and so many other places around the world.
Japan, yeah.
In Japan, yes, thank you. And
by the number of participants and from where they're from, truly impressive. There is a thirst. No.
Lebanon as well.
Yeah.
And
I'll
thanks
for having us all
say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. As we come at the end to this webinar, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our distinguished speakers and to everyone who joined us from around the world. I would also like to extend a special thank you to our technical support team, especially our wonderful Araceli, and to all NABE team for their support and for their making this event possible. Thank you for your participation. We look forward to welcoming you to future NABE webinar. A replay of this session will be available shortly. So have a wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie.